Life's tough
when you're in PC.
Life's rough
When you depend on me.
to give you
weapons and
certain information for your journey and still you still push to try to hurt me. Life's tough
When you're in PC.
Life's rough.
When you
Welcome to the second episode of the Critter Miss Special Series. We're not going to count the one where I was rambling on a vlog. The last time that we were here, we discussed the problem with GURPS, and today we're going to discuss a very bad trend I've seen some DMs make in the past, especially with non-D&D based games. And this is what I'm going to lovingly call the trial by fire. Before we get into what that means, a little backstory for those out there who don't stray too far away from the realms of D&D. I think you can tell from this show that there is a wide world of games out there, each of which range in popularity among fans. D&D is pretty ubiquitous. You have your indie darlings that tend to be found and championed by a small number of people, and then you have your in-between groups. These are the groups that have significant and fervent fan bases. This is where your World of Darkness comes in, your Call of Cthulhu, your Shadowrun, your Legends of the Five Rings, and just about every movie and TV-based games out there. These are games with huge fan bases behind them that are now actually starting to dip into the cross-generational thing. But more importantly, these are the games that have a very distinct and noticeable culture behind them. D&D has, and does still have a culture to it, but it's rather homogenous at this point compared to other games. The purpose of D&D and its creators, Wizards of the Coast, is to get people playing, especially new players. There are stories, cultures, and so forth, but all of that can literally be cast aside, and you can run whatever the hell you see fit. World of Darkness, Five Rings, Call of Cthulhu, and so forth, you don't really have that option, especially with games based on pre-generated mythos like movies and television shows. You have to be immersed deep within the game and understand a massive amount of the etiquette, history, culture, and mythos in order to really fully grasp the game and play it. This is honestly the area that I have the most fun with role-playing games. It's these ones with these big, expansive mythos and stories behind it. They're very fascinating. As a matter of fact, this is where Vampire the Masquerade, one of my favorite games of all time, comes in. Another one of my favorite games is a game called Thieves' World. And this is a game that was actually based on a series of books from the 80s that I hadn't had a chance to read until after I picked up and played this game. Another one of my favorites, Legends of the Five Rings, is a game that I've never really had a chance to play, but I actually love reading the book. I love the story behind it. These gigantic mythoses, these gigantic stories, are honestly some of the best games out there. Believe me, I do recommend for those who do not stray outside the realms of D&D to seek out these games and play them. You will really enjoy them, and especially since these are now easily available thanks to the internet and the more focused gaming stores. You can find mountains of content on the internet to help you along. However, there's a slight problem that you should try to avoid at all cost. I mean, of course there is. What kind of show would this be if it was nothing but sunshine and rainbows? Here is the thing. These games have expansive cultures and expansive fans who are more than ready to add you to the club. But there are some people out there, a noticeable minority, who have a certain way of introducing people into their games. And those are the people who believe in the trial by fire method of introducing people to their beloved games. Personally speaking, I call them shit lickers, but you can come up with any name you so choose. Now, there are distinctions from what I mean by this, so bear this in mind as I go forward. I'll explain myself thoroughly. With that said, let's start with what it means to be a trial-by-fire style of storytelling. For a lot of people who have been immersed in different cultures of games, there's a lot of love that grows, as with any other hobby. This game is amazing, and other people should enjoy it, is basically the thought process. But you definitely want people to be as invested as you when you introduce them to the game. It makes total sense. Once a person is introduced to something, you want them to know and understand everything. But unlike D&D, where your biggest threat, unless generated by the DM specifically, is not breaking laws or being a dick, there is a pre-generated culture that cannot be avoided in these games. In order to fully illustrate this, I'm going to use Vampire the Masquerade as an example. Now, for the people who are not initiated into Vampire the Masquerade, let me give you a quick breakdown. There are three factions, the Camarilla, the Sabbat, and the Anarchs. Each of three are supposed to be loosely interpreted from the three schisms of Christianity. The Camarilla are representative of Roman Catholicism, the Sabbat are representative of Eastern Orthodoxy, and the Anarchs are representative of Protestantism. Now, in the game, the Camarilla and the Sabbat are pretty much warring factions. They have very different philosophical views on how vampire society should withhold itself. For the Camarilla, they believe very much in the traditions, and they believe in keeping their identity secret. Now, when it comes to Sabbat, the Sabbat believe that they are the next stage of human evolution, and humans should be subservient to them. Whenever you're running a game, it's typically not a good idea to have Camarilla and Sabbat intermix, especially if you're doing it in a traditional style. The reason being is because the Camarilla and Sabbat not only dislike each other, have very different philosophical views, but also will actively attempt to kill each other because they are warring factions. Now, unlike D&D, where the thief and the paladin can put aside their differences, the Camarilla and the Sabbat typically don't put aside their differences. The only time that they do is for temporary alliances where there is some bigger threat involved, or if someone is thinking of jumping ship to the other side. So, whenever you're running a vampire game, if you have a Camarilla and a Sia Sabbat, that Camarilla is probably going to die relatively quickly. Other way around as well. If there is one Sabbat in the mix of the Camarillas, and the other Camarilla vampires know this, that vampire is more than likely going to be executed. Being the storyteller for a vampire game, you of course know this, and typically speaking, you will inform the new players of this culture so as not to cause problems. However, the problem of the trial by fire storyteller is one who purposely withholds this information. And this is our first distinction of what it means to be a trial by fire storyteller. A trial by fire storyteller is not somebody who creates a certain plot for the characters to fight against. That's not exactly the case. A trial by fire storyteller is a person who purposely withholds character-destroying information for the means of sending a message. It may be splitting some fine hairs, but the distinction comes into play when a character can be screwed over by no fault of their own because the storyteller chose to withhold information. Not telling a character that Shovelheads and Blood Brothers exist in the Sabbat isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is stuff they can easily learn through proper investigation, gaming, and immersion. However, if you do not tell a player that being the sole Sabbat in a room filled with Camarilla can quickly lead to a very, very bad death, then that is actually being a dick. I completely understand why these comes up. I at least see the logic to it. It's either A, you want to protect your game from the non-serious players. B, you really want to immerse people. C, you think it'll be a good plot point. Or D, there is this idea that if you suffered in the beginning, they also have to suffer because that's the culture of it. But here's the thing. No matter what happens, no matter what your intentions may be, whenever you do this, you always come across as an asshole. And you typically turn people away from actually wanting to play your game. I've run into a large number of nerds who refused to play a game I wanted to run just because they had an experience with a DM like this in the past who wanted to fuck with them more than they did want to create a fun game. I have run into several who have rage quit games because someone wanted to use the trial by fire method. I myself have rage quit games because of people who want to be dicks more than they want to have a fun and tell a good story. I have never run into this much for Vampire the Masquerade, but I thought it would be a good explanation. Typically speaking, for Vampire the Masquerade, the people you run into will love to tell you about the mountains upon mountains of mythos. Says the man who wrote a 26-page intro guide for my friends to read whenever they want to play Vampire the Masquerade and they're new to it. It may or may not be mandatory. Shut up! But But this definitely shows up a lot more in LARPs, definitely in Mage and in Lord of the Five Rings. You will run into these people. They pop up a lot more than you would think. And they will make you want to throw the book through a window. The reason I bring this up is due to the fact that these games are cool. They're some of the coolest games out there. And as well-intentioned as the Trial by Fire storyteller is, they ultimately end up pushing people away instead of bringing people in to a really fun experience, a really cool game, and great stories for either the sake of indoctrination or the idea, the relatively foolhardy idea, that if I suffered, everybody else must suffer in order to enjoy. Ultimately, the Trial by Fire storytelling approach is one that's best left off the table. It only serves to alienate people, and honestly, if you alienate people, they don't want to play in your games. They don't want to game with you. And really, trust me on this, telling the story, the history, the culture is some of the best part of gaming. It's some of the things that I live for whenever I introduce people to one of my favorite games. So, this has been much more of imploring people not only to recognize when you're in a Trial by Fire storytelling game, but also to those who use that technique to realize what you're doing and how this could not exactly work in your favor. With that said, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe for more. And come back next week for another episode of Crit or Miss. I hope you have a good one.
Life's tough.
When you're in PC.
Life's rough.
When you depend on me.
To give you
Weapons,
weapons,
items,
armor,
armor,
information.